for Energy Economics. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Should We Pump the Brakes on Electric Vehicles? A Pro-Climate Perspective. USAEE provides a forum for the exchange of ideas, issues, and experience for professionals interested in energy economics. The organization produces professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations and a host of other products and services found on our website, usaee.org. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website for future viewing. If you have questions, please click the Q&A at the bottom of your window. Questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Marie Fagan, Chief Economist, London Economics International, and Chair of the USAEE Business Committee. Marie.
Thanks a lot, Doug, and welcome to our webinar today. The USAEE Business Committee is very pleased to be hosting and providing this very timely webinar. We've got two great speakers to address US policy with respect to electric vehicles. And what I especially like about their approach, as you'll hear, is it takes an integrated view of the energy system, not just vehicles. And we're hoping that the format that we chose for this webinar helps you to examine the evidence, examine your own assumptions about effective ways to address carbon emissions. So let me briefly introduce our speakers. We're pleased to have Dr. David Rapson, who's an associate professor of economics and the director of the Davis Energy Economics program at UC Davis. He studies how firms and consumers make decisions and what this implies for optimal policy and regulation. He's currently researching electric vehicles and electricity markets and pricing and climate policy. So based on his research, Dave will lay out some of the issues and provide his policy perspective. And he'll be speaking about 30 minutes. And then to provide an industry perspective and response, we're pleased to welcome Max Parnes with Toyota North America. Max is a program manager in Toyota's Sustainability and Regulatory Affairs Group in Washington, D.C., and his team conducts energy and environmental research to support Toyota's sustainability, regulatory, and business objectives. And his team has also conducted recent research on vehicle grid integration. So as I mentioned, we've set this up to promote a lively debate and an examination of a lot of our assumptions that go along with policy making. And we'll hear first from Dave Rapson. So you can take it away, Dave. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marie. Just gonna get my slides up here. Okay, so thank you very much, Marie and Doug, for your introduction. Thanks to USAEE for hosting this event and to Max for agreeing to be part of this conversation. Much of the work that I'm going to present today was done with co-authors or colleagues in the economics profession, and I don't usually give a disclaimer, but they may not share my perspectives exactly here. So the title of the talk, Should We Pump the Brakes on Electric Vehicles? A Pro-Climate Perspective, is intended to be slightly provocative because I am concerned that we find ourselves in this area of policy, as with so many other things today, in a very polarized world. And my hope is that, you know, the shared purpose that we have around solving big problems like climate change and good intentions can be an antidote to the polarization that we face, and it's within that context that I want to present these ideas and start this conversation. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a background about transportation electrification and then move on to kind of two substantive sections that present some results from recent research around subsidizing electric vehicles and banning gasoline cars. and trying to answer the question, are electric vehicles substitutes for gasoline cars, which I think is still a major question that needs to be answered before we kind of shove all our chips in the middle to the electric vehicle solution. And then I'm going to zoom out with some closing remarks. So the first thing in terms of background is just acknowledging that climate change is a global collective action problem. So what this plot shows is simply energy consumption by different regions on the planet. And what you can see is that, in 2010 and 2020, the OECD is, more than half of the energy consumption. And in the future, the consumption will actually grow much faster in the developing world. This is completely relevant to the question of how to mitigate climate change, because economic activity is something that we, I think, all want to promote among the lowest income countries in the world to help to pull people out of poverty, for example, and allow all human beings to flourish. And yet economic growth is linked to energy use. And so this creates kind of a little bit of a challenge. Transportation is about 20% of greenhouse gas emissions on the planet right now, and that's growing. And it's growing because as lower income populations become richer, they want to avail themselves of transportation services, which at the moment are basically gasoline powered cars. So I was wondering whether it would be beneficial at all to show this pie chart, but I just thought it might be a helpful reminder about where we find ourselves today in terms of this potential transition towards electrification. It is in its very earliest stages, and roughly about 1% of the global vehicle fleet is electric. The rest is powered by gasoline or diesel. And so the electrification vision that we have in mind here is that the electric grid, which is currently overwhelmingly fossil fuel based, will be converted to renewable electricity generation, which is clean and free from emissions, and that transportation services are going to be shifted from gasoline or diesel and over to electricity that is also powered by this new clean renewable grid. This is a very inspiring vision, and it has captured not just the imagination of policymakers everywhere, but it's become kind of a very maybe not universally held, but ubiquitous idea among progressives who want to solve this very difficult problem. This seems like a pathway to decarbonizing the economy that has gained a lot of support. And that's all wonderful, but one of the challenges with that vision is that at the moment in the world, over 60% of electricity comes from fossil fuels, with a majority of that coming from coal, and then the rest coming from natural gas. And as you can see in this plot here, in recent years, wind and solar have really started to take off, but they still are a very small fraction of the global electricity generation mix. And so when you think about converting transportation services from gasoline and diesel to electricity, that first component of the vision, the shift from fossil fuels to renewables, is immensely important, because it really doesn't help us all that much if what we do is switch from gasoline to coal and natural gas. Nonetheless, governments have really put a lot of weight behind this vision. 17 governments, last time I checked a couple weeks ago, have declared plans to ban gasoline cars. So this is not just a plan to support electrification, but a vision of complete electrification where the dominant technology at present is going to be eliminated. This was articulated in Britain in 2017, China, California. There are many others, and the ones I list here are just some of the earliest declarations. But these are bold aspirations by many large governments. The present administration in the US has proposed almost $200 billion for electric vehicle subsidies and infrastructure. And this is an indication as well of the vision that the US has that's aligned with transportation electrification. So let's take just a step back and think about, free from this particular manifestation of a decarbonization vision, let's think about what an effective emissions reduction strategy will look like. It's going to, first of all, reduce pollution. And that should go without saying, but I put a couple exclamation marks there because this conversion to electric vehicles right now is not going to actually reduce pollution in many places. I am actually giving this talk from Halifax, Nova Scotia, and in Nova Scotia, we've got about 2/3 of our electricity generated from coal. There are some very big challenges associated with decarbonizing here in Nova Scotia, and yet the government has announced electric vehicle subsidies, and this just reveals a lack, I think, of understanding about the importance of the time and place of these policies. Perhaps Nova Scotia should be really going all electric at a time when the grid has been cleaned up, but right now it is not the time. So time and place are very important for pollution reduction. An effective emissions reduction strategy is going to mitigate risk. We have no idea what technology is going to look like in 2035 or 2050. And so you shouldn't take my word or anybody else's word about what the future is going to look like. There's simply an immense amount of uncertainty. And so we want to adopt policies that are robust to that uncertainty. And one of the concepts that is most helpful in thinking about that is technology neutrality. Okay, so this is essentially talking about pursuing policies that address pollution, but don't choose technological winners. And the reason why that's advantageous is it allows new information and technology to be incorporated into the solution, into the economy over time. And finally, an effective emissions reduction strategy is going to be a model that developing countries can follow. It must allow for economic growth among the poorest countries among us. And in order for that to be possible, we really need to pay attention to cost. It's not just a matter of throwing immense resources towards electrification in the developed world and assuming that the developing world is going to follow. It's going to be much more complicated than that. And I'm going to dive into some of these issues. So when I think about this and try to figure out how to communicate this to broad audiences, there are basically three categories of government policy options that are available relating to EVs. So one is do nothing. And this, I think, is reckless because there are currently unpriced negative externalities from the burning of fossil fuels, and we should do something about that. Climate change really does need government intervention. But the policies that governments seem to have favored initially are these direct policies of subsidies, bans, and mandates that are expensive, they're poorly targeted, and they have unintended consequences that tend to undermine the primary objectives of the policies themselves. The alternative, which I would advocate for, is thinking about prices more carefully. You want to address pollution by making it expensive rather than choosing one technology over another. And by setting prices right, it aligns incentives of consumers and firms to make decisions that are aligned with the public good. And this turns out to be less expensive and more resilient to new information and technologies. So that's the landscape. And now I want to take a little bit of time to talk about, oh, did we just lose? screen sharing. Let me get back to that. Okay, so I want to take a little bit of time to talk about subsidies and bans and mandates. And the first thing I want to just point out is that electric vehicles are not zero emissions vehicles. This label that has been given to them is, I think, misleading because electricity is typically in just about everywhere in the world is generated from some amount of fossil fuel generation. So, you know, this is a map of the US that comes from a paper by some of my colleagues, Holland, Manser, Muller, and Yates, that includes the damages not just of carbon emissions, but also of local criteria pollutants, which lead to health damages and are a very serious component of burning fossil fuels. And what you can see here is that, you know, in the West, if you plug in an electric vehicle, well, it doesn't create much damage and is probably much cleaner than a gasoline car. But if you plug in an electric vehicle in the Midwest, there's a lot of coal that's going to be fired up on the margin. And I just, you know, this paper that HMMY wrote was from 2016, but still today in 2021, about 70% of the Midwest grid is fossil fuel generated. So where these electric vehicles go is going to matter for the emissions abatement that's achieved from their adoption. And a one-size-fits-all federal subsidy, for example, is not going to direct the vehicles to where they should necessarily go. Nonetheless, subsidies have been a major driver of EV demand, and I've written a couple papers on this, but instead of citing my own work, I wanted to just show this graph that kind of tells the story. So in Georgia, before 2015, there was an electric vehicle tax credit that offered a couple $1,000s to EV buyers, and this really stimulated a lot of demand. In 2015, they removed the credit and actually implemented a fee for electric vehicles. And as you can see, demand for electric vehicles kind of fell off a cliff. So this should plant a seed of curiosity in our minds about how much people really want electric vehicles. If you pay people enough money, they're going to, you know, do whatever you want. They're going to adopt whatever technology you want them to adopt. But if you remove those subsidies, then we get a sense of the utility that they get from that good. And it appears as though subsidies are very effective. And that's, you know, not just from this one graph, but from a bunch of academic research, some of which I've published. But subsidies, unfortunately, produce unintended consequences. So, you know, they may be needed in order to overcome the cost, you know, the increased cost of EVs due to batteries, essentially, over gasoline cars. So we need the subsidies to get the price down, but they're going to put more cars on the road. They're not going to reduce driving in gasoline cars. There's no sense in which subsidizing EVs gets drivers of other cars to change their behavior. It's going to promote the driving of electric vehicles in areas with coal electricity, because the subsidies don't distinguish, a federal subsidy at least, not going to distinguish between, you know, which areas of the country have a lot of coal and which don't. There's a very interesting paper about how if you make gasoline cars scarce or fuel inefficient cars scarce, they become more valuable, and that leads them to live longer. This is not what we want. We don't want to be implementing policies that cause gasoline cars to live longer in the economy, and that's what electric vehicle subsidies are going to do. They're also going to drive down the price of oil if effective, because people will be, you know, substituting their demand away from gasoline and towards electricity. And I'm going to talk a little later on about the general equilibrium effects that will have that are, you know, concerning when we think about long-run solutions to climate change. Price is not the only factor, though, that's going to determine future demand. And here I'm drawing a couple maps from a paper that I recently wrote with Jim Arksmith at Maryland and my colleague Eric Muliger at UC Davis. And this is just simply plotting the market share of sedans and trucks in the US in 2017 and 2018. And what you can see is they're kind of mirror images of each other. And if I were to superimpose a map of electric vehicle demand over these, it would look very much like the sedan market share map. So electric vehicles are being purchased where people like to have sedans, and that's mainly because electric vehicles are only available in the sedan type up until very recently. And the truck market share, on the other hand, is first of all very high. You can see the scale of this. Light truck. So these light trucks include pickup trucks, SUVs, and minivans, and those comprise over half of new cars sold in the U.S. And so the first thing this says is if we want to actually electrify transportation, there need to be products that are going to be available to people who prefer to drive trucks than sedans. There was another very interesting relationship that we saw in that paper that relates to non-price factors that determine EV demand, and that's the relationship between belief in climate change and vehicle choice. So here in the left panel, we can see that on the y-axis here is the percent of people who believe that climate change is happening, and the x-axis is the fraction of sedan sales that are EVs. And you can see an upward sloping, very clear upward sloping relationship there. When people believe in climate change, they are more likely to buy electric vehicles. On the other hand, you have the opposite relationship with truck ownership. And this means that even if you end up having light truck EV models that are viable substitutes for gasoline trucks, this segment of the consumer base may not be as likely to adopt them as the people who buy sedans. So that creates some uncertainty about the complete electrification vision. And the last non-price factor graph that I want to show you is just some simulations that Eric, Jim, and I did in this paper that show the future EV market share. So these are showing EV market shares in 2035 at different growth rates. So we're assuming high, medium, and low growth rates in innate demand for electric vehicles, and then we're allowing the government to subsidize those vehicles as well. And what you can see is the steepness of these lines tells you that subsidies are not going to be incredibly effective, or at least they're going to be very expensive ways to buy more EV adoption. On the other hand, the availability of trucks is very important. You can see that when EV trucks are available in a high growth scenario in 2035, you can get to 40, 50, 60% EV penetration. When there are no trucks available, if that market segment hasn't really caught on, then it caps the total EV market share quite dramatically. So there are a lot of non-monetary factors that are going to determine the success of this technology. And we simply do not know. It's too early in the stage of this technology to really know how successful it's going to be, how desirable EVs are going to be to the masses. So you might just say, well, then, why not just ban gasoline cars? And there's a really great paper, again, by Holland, Manser, and Yates that digs into this. I'm just going to very briefly summarize the result, which is, the reason why we economists do not advocate for bans is because there's a huge benefit associated with driving gasoline cars today. They have this really bad aspect of emitting a lot of pollutants, but they also provide a lot of benefits in the form of cheap transportation services, and that's why people buy them. And so these benefits are likely to persist long into the future. And the only time when we really should consider banning gasoline cars or mandating electric vehicles is when EVs are as good or better than gasoline cars, and the remaining buyers of gasoline cars are basically making mistakes. And we're just nowhere close to that being the case. And it's unclear in 2035, 2040, when some of these governments have declared that they're going to ban gasoline cars. It's really unclear whether this is going to have changed much by then. Okay, so I now am going to pivot to some recent research of mine that essentially asks the question, are electric vehicles substitutes for gasoline cars? And the first result I want to share is just simply that EVs are being used less than we thought. And so in this paper with Fiona Burlig at Chicago, Jim Bushnell, also at UC Davis, and Catherine Wolfram, who is at Berkeley but currently on leave with the Biden administration, we assembled a data set of 10% of California households and in their electricity meter data, and we matched electric vehicle registration data to that. So for every household in our data, we know when an electric vehicle shows up at that household. And what we do is we just look at how electricity use changes before and after. And what we find is that charging is at about 2.9 kilowatt hours per day. And we adjust that upwards to account for our best estimate of away from home charging. We convert it using the fuel economy of the cars that these people have purchased. And we find that vehicle miles traveled in electric vehicles in California are about 6,700 miles per year, which is dramatically lower than the mileage of gasoline cars. And, you know, this should raise a lot of questions, right? If EVs are, you know, this perfect substitute for gasoline cars, then we would expect them to be driven the same way. This is evidence that perhaps that's not happening. And the question is, why? Well, there are several different explanations, and we're investigating these in ongoing research. I'm going to show you a couple results that help to pick away at this. But you know, overall, I think what I want you to take away from this is there are many unanswered questions, and we still are at a very early stage of understanding why EVs are used less than ICEs, than gasoline cars. It could be that low battery range of these early vehicles is really relevant. People want to drive without the anxiety of running out of fuel. And, you know, more recent battery EVs have larger battery capacity and they relieve that range anxiety. That could be the whole story or part of the story. It could just be that early adopters are different. They don't drive as much as other drivers. It could be that EVs are, in some cases, complements to gasoline cars instead of substitutes. That would be very concerning from a climate change perspective, because what it means is you're actually adding more transportation services through the adoption of EVs. Electricity prices in California are very high. That's where the study was done. You know, maybe there are other undesirable attributes of EVs. These are all hypotheses that need to be tested before we can really understand what's going on. But I'm going to show you a little bit of evidence about two of those hypotheses. So first, battery range doesn't fully explain low EVMT in our sample. We estimate electricity consumption for different car types. And here I'm plotting just the battery range of those cars against the electricity consumption. And you can see that basically, sure, you've got these really high range Teslas up here that are consuming much more electricity. They're driving more in those Teslas. But the Bolt has a very large battery capacity as well, and it's not really being driven much more than these other EVs in the sample. So battery range doesn't really seem to explain low EVMT entirely. We also have the ability in this data set to match all of the cars to households. So we see every car that's in a household over time. And it turns out that when people buy gasoline cars, about a quarter of the time, those are replacing another gasoline car. So those are substituting the new car for an old car. And we see that at the time of adoption, the household portfolio for a household that buys a gasoline car is going up by 0.75 cars. So that's the 1 in 4 being replaced. But when we look at the same plot for electric vehicles, each electric vehicle is adding 1 full car to the household portfolio. And that means that they're not replacing ICEs, at least in this sample of ours. And again, this is potentially very concerning as it relates to transportation emissions. Okay, so I'm going to close up with a little bit of an extended conclusion here. Usually I'll just do one slide, but I want to hit a few different points as I close up. So as we look forward, there are many uncertainties. And so when we think about a vision of 100% electrification in transportation, we want to acknowledge that there are lots of questions that we need to answer before that's going to be possible. The first is, will mainstream drivers adopt electric vehicles? And if they don't want them, should they be forced to through bans and mandates? Globally, how do we get to 100% renewable electricity or close to it? Remember, over 60% of global electricity generation right now is from oil and gas. So, acknowledging that if we, sorry, that should say coal and gas. We do not want to shift from gasoline to coal. It's a little better to go from gasoline to natural gas. But really, this vision of transportation electrification relies on getting to close to 100% renewable. And we're just in the very early stages of that. We don't know what that transition is going to do to electricity prices, and we don't know what that transition is going to do to electricity reliability. These are major issues when you're talking about transforming the entire energy economy. There are also going to be macroeconomic consequences to transforming an economy like the US in the way that's being envisioned. So in economics, we call these general equilibrium effects. Here we're talking about dramatically reducing the amount of gasoline that the US consumes and dramatically increasing the amount of renewable electricity and electric vehicle batteries that are being produced. Now, what is the effect that that's going to have on the global economy? Is it going to create scarcity in raw materials that's going to drive up the price of EVs eventually? Is electrification going to lead to low gasoline prices? These are uncertainties that are genuine and that we need to resolve in order for this vision to actually be a good one. Okay, looking forward, the second slide here, are there other lower cost greenhouse gas abatement options? Subsidizing electric vehicles is extremely expensive per ton of carbon abated. There are other technologies like direct air capture, which at least in pilot phases are available at about $400 per ton of CO2 captured. Now, is this scalable? I'm not sure. How reliable is that? I'm not sure. There are questions about those technologies as well. But to the extent we can suck carbon out of the atmosphere for, say, $400 a ton, that also tells us that we shouldn't really be doing anything else that is more expensive in cost per ton abated. So how do we identify these lower cost abatement options? Well, we do it through pricing, right? We do it through raising the price of pollution, which creates headroom for new technologies to be profitable. So it's my view that carbon pricing is necessary for us to deal with the climate change issue. It might not be sufficient because there are other pollution externalities and other potentially innovation externalities as well. But we really do need to get serious about carbon pricing. And one of the main reasons is because it's technology neutral. It is going to allow for the market to stimulate innovation and for new solutions to arise. And if instead we're just shoving all our chips in the middle on this particular technology, that's quite a risky endeavor. Finally, I think an underappreciated consideration here is what happens to developing countries. So currently there are about 1 billion people in the world who don't have any electricity. There are billions more who live on grids that do not reliably supply electricity. They have outages that are frequent and long. And if oil prices crater because the Western world shifts to electricity for transportation, that's going to mean that oil prices oil's a very cheap option for these developing countries. And they're going to look at the suite of transportation options available to them and say, which one should we choose for our objectives, which, include economic growth. And I think this raises an ethical question. Should the West, should wealthy countries deny these developing countries access to gasoline technologies? I think, if you answer no to that question, then we need to be more sophisticated about how we're approaching this than just saying, let's electrify. So should we pump the brakes on EVs? Just getting back to the title of the talk. Well, electric vehicle technology is certainly promising, and it's going to be a big part of the future. And I think that we should encourage EVs, but only do so indirectly via pollution taxes, not through incentives or bans or mandates that are choosing EVs as the winner over current technologies or yet to be invented technologies. There's still massive uncertainties that need to be resolved. And so I would say pump the brakes on EV subsidies, bans, and mandates, and get incentives right via prices. And there's a model that we have that helps us to inform how that can look. And it's Norway. So a lot of EV advocates point to Norway and they say, hey, let's just do that. And I agree with them entirely. But what are they doing? They're not subsidizing EVs at all. They're taxing gasoline cars immensely. And so this is really, more of a stick than a carrot approach. And I think they got that right. They also have the benefit of having a 98% renewable electricity grid and a $1.1 trillion sovereign wealth fund that largely came from fossil fuel sales. So it's not exactly a replicable situation for the rest of the world, but I do think we can learn from Norway. And the main takeaway is we need to increase the cost of polluting technologies. So in closing, humility is appropriate here. What we're talking about is a transformation of the global energy economy. We don't know what technology is going to look like in the future in 2035 or 2050. And anybody who tells you that they do is lying, and you should not believe them. We should be pursuing policies that acknowledge this uncertainty. Also, the best policies in rich countries are going to address future needs of poor countries, not just the OECD. And that's not just an ethical observation. It's the reality that a ton of carbon emitted in the developing world contributes equally to climate change as a ton emitted in the developed world. So I view this as an opportunity for true collective action. I think that unilateral, partisan action is probably going to get it wrong. This is an opportunity, I think, the climate change issue, to reach across the aisle and go beyond what is just currently feasible in the US and really try to find serious long-run solutions to this very tricky problem. Thank you, and I'll pass that along to Max now.
Great. Can everybody hear me? I think so. Okay.
Yes,
so
we can.
Great. Well, thanks a lot. First of all, thanks to USAEE for having me. I'm really pleased to be a respondent for this panel. I'm going to try to keep my remarks somewhat brief, so there's time for some Q&A at the end. I appreciated Dave's many thoughtful comments, and I'm going to respond to a few of them here in a detailed way. Before I embark on doing that, I do want to say that electrification is a truly important topic for Toyota, and one that we are very much accelerating on. Toyota has a wealth of experience in electrification, having sold more than 17 million electrified vehicles globally, and a little over 4 million in the US, primarily hybrid, and that's more than any other OEM. So to get to a carbon zero future, we need a team approach. So industry and governments aligned and focused on meeting consumer needs. The ultimate goal of all of this is getting to carbon neutrality, but, and or I should say, and the customer decides about what vehicle to purchase, right? Those vehicle purchases happen one customer at a time. So what policies can we put in place to promote electrification to customers? So what's Toyota doing? Well, by 2025, every vehicle, Toyota and Lexus, is going to have an electrified option, meaning hybrid, plug-in hybrid, battery electric, fuel cell, and fuel cells, hydrogen fuel cell. We expect our share of electrified vehicles in the US to increase from 23% today to 70% by 2030. And when I say, just to be clear, when I say electrified, that includes hybrid. And our next step on that, which was just announced yesterday, is the BZ4X, which is a battery or electric SUV that's going to go on sale in 2022 in the US. So, we're doing a lot. And maybe one area where I'm going to disagree with Professor Rapson a little bit is on subsidies. We do think that those are going to continue to be important. But let me start out. I just have a short presentation that I want to give so that I can kind of get back in a detailed way to sort of visualize some of this stuff. So, okay, let me just get this to go. Okay. Share. Great. Okay, so this should be up. I hope everybody can see this. So this is just meant to sort of visualize the fact that in addition to location, electricity emissions also vary by time of day. This is something that Dave brought up about how in the West or the Midwest, emissions are higher of electricity. And so if one is to do a very sort of BEV-centric approach to decarbonization, location matters, time matters too. So I'm going to talk about time in two ways. First is day by day. So here's just some screenshots from the California ISO, the grid operator for California. So on the left here, this is CO2 varying throughout the day. What's going on there is that in the middle of the day, you get a lot of solar coming online. And so you can see that in the right chart. If you charge your plug-in hybrid or BEV during, peak solar hours during daytime, the marginal emission is zero, right? It's coming from solar. So arguably that is a great impact for battery electrification and plug-in hybrids. The problem is that the sun doesn't shine at nighttime. And so absent some kind of tremendous energy storage where we can shift all of that solar into a battery or compressed air or hydrogen, whatever, it makes it very challenging to get that right in terms of charging the vehicles with the low emissions electricity. So I said that's sort of hour by hour, day by day, and by year is also, this is another important aspect of the temporal issue associated with electricity. California has a very high renewable penetration now. It's seeking even higher in the future. Those of you who've seen the duck curve before, I won't belabor the point, but what you're going to get is this is sort of year by year. And what's happening is you sort of go from 2014 to 2021, you're seeing a greater and greater ramping that's happening as a result of the increased penetration of renewables. Because what's happening is more renewables during the daytime drops the belly of the duck curve down further, but then you have to wind up, having higher emissions when you don't have another option. So there's this effect happening here where there's greater variation in emissions from month by month going year by year as a result of higher penetration of renewables. So you have the hour by hour or day by day issue, and then you also have these longer temporal issues as well. So just wanted to kind of draw that out in addition to Dave's points about the location aspect. Okay, so what? Well, PEVs still have emissions. I mean, sometimes I think that's neglected, and there's a lot of happy talk around the fact that you have a zero tailpipe. Well, you still have emissions from the smokestack, and you have to think about how do you do that. So there's lots of policies to reduce emissions from the smokestacks, and that's happening. The challenge is how do you get the EVs to charge at the right time of day to use that renewable electricity? So the prevailing approach among utilities has been to charge the vehicles off-peak, which typically means at nighttime. The problem is those off-peak tariffs don't always align between low emissions and low cost. You know, if you're in a solar area, the sun doesn't shine at nighttime. So, you know, unless you have a lot of wind or big storage, big battery, you're probably not charging renewable. So another issue I think is what's customer price elasticity or willingness to shift charging in response to pricing. I'm going to get tomatoes thrown at me for this, for saying this on a call with economists, that prices don't matter. I mean, I think they do. It's just a question of how much do customers care and how much are they willing to shift. And I think that's, you know, there's still not a lot of great evidence in that area, in my opinion. Now, OEMs, I think automotive OEMs can play a really important role here. We just launched a program called Clean Assist for our customers in California, where they can get free renewable electricity charging, totally free to them for all the charging that they do in California. And, you know, we're doing that through RECs, which are a way of tracking renewable production. So that's something we're doing with the assistance of the low carbon fuel standard. And that's an example of supportive policies for decarbonization. I think that happens to work well. And there's a good program we're doing there. So we can do a lot there. We can also help get vehicles to charge at the right time of day. There's a lot that can happen. So, but suffice it to say, you know, just because you have an EV, you know, if you're charging it off of less than clean power, the emissions reductions aren't being realized. So Dave brought up a lot of really good points around, you know, what are consumers doing? Are EVs really a substitute for an ICE, so on and so forth. I just wanted to put this here. This is sales. This is sales mix. And I hadn't looked at this in a while, but this is kind of, you know, through COVID, coming out of COVID. You don't see a whole lot of change. At the bottom is hybrid. In the little blue sliver is plug-in hybrid. Then you have EV, that means a full BEV, and then fuel cell is a little red sliver on top. So BEV is still around, you know, 2% of the market. Hybrid is a little more than that. It's between 3 to 6%, you know, depending on sales cycle. So I think the challenge is how do you get people to want to buy these vehicles in the long run? Toyota's been selling hybrids for the better part of 20 years now. And it's just, you know, sometimes it's a challenge to get additional consumer interest. I think the proliferation of new BEV models is going to help with that. We're part of that with the new SUV that we're introducing. You know, at the same time, how do you get customers to want to buy one? Do you just wind up cannibalizing, you know, other sales from other OEMs? How do you make the pie bigger? So I do think that supportive policies are important there. Tax incentives for both the EVs themselves as well as for infrastructure, including hydrogen fueling infrastructure, an important part of that. But yeah, I mean, Dave, to your point, you know, I don't think that anyone can really say that an EV is a perfect substitute right now for an ICE. There's a number of different behavioral things that have to happen, from, you know, being used to some amount of limitation, range limitation, even if it mostly doesn't impact people, right? I mean, it is still a limitation. You know, setting up charging at home. I just had a charging station put in at my house, and, you know, it cost a few $1,000s by the time everything was done. So, you know, if you have to do that at every home, I think there's something like 80 million detached single family homes, and if they each cost a couple $1,000s to do that, you know, you're at a couple billion. So it adds up pretty quick. So yeah, I mean, I think the consumer challenge is a big part of that. And you know, Dave, you were talking about technology neutral policies. I think that's why Toyota is so big on having all different kinds of technologies and powertrains for customers. We think there's a right powertrain for each customer. Some customers just aren't ready to jump into BEV all the way. So a hybrid or a plug-in hybrid or fuel cell could, well, maybe not fuel cell yet, but a hybrid or a plug-in hybrid could be a good option for them as they kind of put their toe in the water and get used to electrification. So yeah, I could keep going. I could keep going, you know, for past the end of this, but this has been, you know, really great. Appreciate the opportunity to serve as a respondent. And I'm gonna pass it back over to Marie to do some Q&A now. Thanks.
Very much, Max, and thanks to Dave. So yeah, we're going to have a moderated Q&A session. So folks, if you want to type questions into the Q&A or even into the chat, we'll pull those together. We've already had one come in, and I think this one is for Dave, and it talks to exactly the kind of programs that were used in Norway to incentivize electric vehicles and disincentivize gasoline vehicles, tax breaks, et cetera. So David, do you want to address that?
Yeah, for sure. So, I don't know all the ins and outs of the Norway policies, but my understanding is that there are all sorts of soft kind of non-monetary incentives that they have for electric vehicles as well, around HOV lanes and whatnot. But the main one that you hear about that I think is the biggest financial incentive is that you don't have to pay the vehicle fee, the vehicle tax that is required when you buy a gasoline car. And what that does is it makes a Tesla Model 3 the same cost as a Toyota Corolla. And a lot of people choose a Tesla when they're the same price there. But the key to the Norway situation is they did not throw a lot of subsidies at the EVs. They actually taxed the gasoline cars, and I think that this is a very important shift in the mindset that's required. We can't solve this whole problem of climate change through carrots. There have to be sticks.
Okay, thanks. And we have a question I would say for both panelists to jump in on. So what about folks who live in, say, multifamily housing, for example, high rises? How do you get your vehicles charged? And maybe Max can comment, and then Dave.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of interest in this area. I'll kind of take it in two parts. What do you do about people who live in existing high rises and then future? And I'll explain why. There's a lot of building code updates going on the local level where they're requiring that new parking garages are made ready for EV charging, which will reduce the cost of doing that, which is great. I think that's one wonderful way of doing it. The problem is, what about everybody else who is in existing housing? And given the stock and flow of how housing works, I mean, most people are going to live in existing housing through, I don't know, 2040 for sure. I don't know about 20. So, what do you do? How do you help people who are currently in a multi-unit dwelling? How do you help them? It's challenging. I think you can try to do EV charging hubs. That's something I've heard about with DC fast charging. Challenge there is DC fast charging your vehicle on a consistent basis will degrade the battery life. So it's not clear to me that everybody will do that or that it's necessarily a great option. You can also try to do level 2 charging, which is slower charging street side, but that's expensive, trenching, digging up the street. Who's going to maintain the plugs and all that? So yeah, it's a vexing question. I think a lot of people are working on it. I might suggest that the fact that it's so hard and many people are working on it and that we can't figure out how to do it maybe means that another technology might be a better approach. So, maybe, fuels, that could be a good application for fuel cell, where if you're in a dense area and you need everybody to be able to fuel up or recharge, I'll say fuel up because fuel cell quickly, that could be a better approach for some of those customers. Otherwise, I don't exactly know what you're going to do. Short of retrofitting the entire parking garage for plugs, which is very expensive. And then if it's an apartment building, then you have split incentive, like who's paying the bill for that versus who's paying to live there, and so on. So anyway, I've said enough. Dave, any thoughts?
You covered a lot of territory there. I think that is a great answer. Yeah.
Okay. We have another question for both of you. Interested in your views on how to manage the social equity issues, given the fact that new vehicle sales are only a tiny fraction of total sales. Is there data on the household income of buyers, et cetera? So how I guess from an academic perspective and from an industry perspective on the social equity issues? You want to start, Dave?
Yeah, sure. So first, I want to just highlight that there's been a trend that is very interesting in thinking about social equity in every possible silo, right? As opposed to, when I used to think about social equity issues, it was more general. And so, in a general framework, you wouldn't so much care whether certain subpopulations have the same EV adoption rate as other subpopulations. what you would care about is overall well-being and the well-being of all of those subpopulations overall, but not necessarily in every single silo. And so it's just curious to me that, you know, EVs are something that rich people drive. EV subsidies go almost entirely to rich people. And that's despite efforts, massive efforts on the parts of policymakers to make that not be the case. And so, you know, I guess I have a feeling when it comes to these issues that it's less about how you know, low income and underrepresented minority adoption rates of EVs are, but more, you know, are the environmental outcomes for those subpopulations good? And do they have, you know, the highest standard of living that we can possibly, you know, muster for them, which might be through, you know, helping them to buy electric vehicles, or it might be through transfers, you know, in the form of, you know, wage subsidies or welfare, things like that. So it's, I don't know, it's a hugely complicated issue, but it's pretty clear right now that EV policy is very regressive at benefiting rich households disproportionately.
Dave. Max, any comments?
Yeah, just quickly, you know, I think part of the reason BEVs are so expensive right now is battery costs, and there's a number of forecasts about, you know, how battery costs are going to drop. I would suggest that, you know, a solution that sort of meets a variety of needs is plug-in hybrid. Just anecdotally, I just got a Prius Prime, which is the Prius plug-in for, I think it was 24,000 out of the door at the dealer. Then there's a tax incentive that kind of brings it down to 20,000, which is relatively affordable for a new car. And the question, the person asked the question, I mean, yes, used car market is much larger than the new car market, maybe about twice the size. But, you know, I think $20,000 is much lower than the average car transaction price, which is floated up to around 40,000. And depending on how you drive a plug-in, you know, it could function basically like a BEV. You know, I'm relatively low mileage, and most of the miles I drive on are electric. So could be a great solution, but obviously it's going to take a lot of different approaches to get there, and equity is a huge issue. So again, you know, another pressing question that hasn't been answered.
Actually, and I'd like to ask a question that something came to mind as I was listening. David mentioned raw materials, potential shortages of raw materials. There was just an IEA report about the various minerals and things that would be needed to support the supply chain for electric vehicles. So I actually wanted to ask Max, what is Toyota's view of potential mineral scarcity? Is it, you know, to the extent that you can share the company's thinking on these issues?
So, you know, we're exploring a variety of energy storage technologies. I mean, you know, as you know, we're doing fuel cell, which is not reliant on many of those critical materials, right? Because it's a different approach. We're also exploring solid state batteries and a number of other plug-in, again, you know, kind of reduces the battery size, and it's something of a hedge there on the risk. Yeah, and then I would just suggest, you know, this is just Max's personal reflection, not official Toyota position, but I read that report, and, you know, it talks about, you know, 20, 30, 40-fold increase in demand for these materials under a 2-degree scenario. And anybody who tells you that they know the price of a commodity when it's going up, you know, 20 by 20x is not telling you the truth. So, you know, I definitely think there's risk there, and the way, in my opinion, the way to deal with risk is to take a portfolio approach, a technology portfolio approach.
Okay, thanks. We're at the top of the hour, but we have one more question, I think. Let's take this one. So I think this could be for both folks, but let's toss this one to Dave first. You mentioned a potential drop in gasoline use in the US. How does this impact tax revenue for highways? And then how do we tax EVs on the road, given higher curb weight and potential road damage if they're not buying gasoline?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I mean, road maintenance is currently, you know, funded through the gasoline tax, which I think the person who asked the question knows. And so if you shift people away from gasoline, then that source of revenue dries up. And yeah, I mean, you know, one option, which has happened in some places, is that there because EVs are using the roads just as much as ICEs, maybe you increase the fees for EVs, but another way to think of it is this is just a public expense. You can fund it through any number of different potential sources of public revenue. I would, I guess maybe I'll push a plug for one of the favorite policies of energy economists is a congestion price. People who use the road are leading to all sorts of different externalities, and getting people to pay to use the road when it's costly to do so, or when the damage that they're producing is higher. So for example, driving 18-wheelers is much more damaging than driving a small car, then those costs should be passed along in some way. But yeah, it's a difficult problem, and it certainly highlights one of the speed bumps in this transition.
Okay, thanks. Well, we're a little past the top of the hour, but Dave, I want to thank you, and Max as well, for joining us on this extremely timely topic. And I think right now I need to turn it over to Doug to close us off.
Well, I just want to, again, to reiterate, Dave and Max, thank you both so much. Marie, thank you for your participation. And mostly we want to thank all the attendees that were here today. So have a good day, everyone.